We can start.
Beseder. So you go first or I go first?
You go first.
It is a huge pleasure being on Unholy. It has been a Thursday night ritual for me for a long time to listen to Yonit and to Jonathan, who I know is hard at work, beavering away on a novel at home in London. So I'll do my best here.
He's writing a book. I think it's about the trials and tribulations of doing a podcast with an Israeli co-host. So it's going to be a 3-volume book, longer than the Robert Caro, Lyndon Johnson.
He'll catch up to Robert Caro very quickly by the end of the week. What we should sum up this newsless, eventless week and to introduce some of what's on the menu for today. On Sunday, the President of the United States issued a statement from his beach house saying he was dropping out of the race, which was a moment right out of William Shakespeare. The same Sunday, by the way, was the hottest day ever recorded on the planet, probably a coincidence. We've had the Houthi attack on Tel Aviv, the counterattack on Yemen. We had the news of what tragically stays the same. The hostages continue to languish in the tunnels of Gaza. The death count of Palestinians in Gaza approaches by most estimates 40,000. And while the world burns, Bibi Netanyahu dithers and boards a plane to Washington. And finally, on Wednesday, Netanyahu delivers that speech to Congress in the afternoon, and Joe Biden, having recovered from COVID, if not from the trauma of facing the reality of confronting his fallen condition politically and mortally, goes before the nation and in a truly emotional speech tells the American people that he'll step aside for Kamala Harris. Nearly everyone feels the emotional power of that speech, except one person, Donald Trump, who takes to Truth Social and declares with all the compassion he can muster that, quote, Biden's speech was barely understandable, unquote. And finally, Yonit, I know this is foremost on your mind. The Mets have been crushing the Yankees in Yankee Stadium, which is both tragic and inexcusable. And so the world continues to spin out of control. And here we are, unholy indeed. Thankfully, Yonit will have Amos Harel of Haaretz to help us make sense of the week in the world, because God knows I cannot.
I mean, David, after that list, I would say that at this point, if aliens landed on Earth, we'd all shrug and say it must be Thursday.
That's right. Thursday night. Aliens land on Earth, Friday to come.
So to our listeners, we will say that the great David Remnick, the editor of The New Yorker, editor-in-chief of The New Yorker for 26 years and Pulitzer Prize-winning author, is our guest co-host this week. These are not the reasons he is the co-host, though, we should say. The reason is that David says he's listened to every episode of Unholy, and he could also do a wicked Jonathan Friedland impersonation, which we might or might not use, may or may not use.
I can't get my voice that deep. That liquid, it's like hot coffee pouring into a mug, that voice. So great.
So, we're very happy that you're here. I'm very happy and honored that you're here, David. And I mean, there's so much to go through. I think I want to ask you how you are. How are you, David, before anything else?
Well, I will tell you that I'm fine-ish, Jewish.
The most
fine,
Jewish
fine-ish.
answer.
And I've just come back about a week ago for my third trip to Israel since October. And I have to tell you, every time I go, it is shattering in one way or another. And I think the existence of everybody in the region is shattered in a way that people that don't visit can't quite absorb from reading the news or even listening to Unholy. It's very, very hard to take on. And there's a lot of that we don't see and can't go to. I mean, because as we know, Gaza is not a place that international press can visit except on these kind of short, very, very limited embeds with the IDF. So it's exhausting to live.
That's what it feels like from this end of the conversation as well. I don't know if it's almost 10 months, and I don't think we ever imagined that we'd be at this point after 10 months. The hostages are still in Gaza, and that there are drones from Yemen, and that, it's just... and the war's still going on. So that is where we are. But to make you feel better, I thought we'd start with talking about American politics.
Fantastic.
Before anything else.
The best.
That seems very simple and easy.
But I depending on your politics, and mine are pretty naked, it is a more hopeful moment. It's a more hopeful moment. I think if you had asked me 2 weeks ago, what did you expect to happen in November? I would glumly say there's no question that Biden was headed toward a really bad defeat. The numbers were getting worse and worse. I think a lot of people, not least young people, were looking at this presidential race with absolute despair. Who are these two old men? And why do I have to choose between them? And Biden, you could totally argue, should have made this or could have made this decision a year ago, but he didn't. And he certainly did not take on board the tragic failure at the debate immediately, in a very human way, you could argue. But he finally did. It was a drama, worthy of King Lear. You remember in King Lear, King Lear makes the decision in the beginning of the play to step down from power, and it turns out to be a kind of tragedy and a catastrophe in so many ways. Biden resisted for reasons you can understand, both humanly and politically. And he thought that even the people that seemed to be well-meaning around him, like Barack Obama, these were people that told him in 2016 not to run. And he stood aside for Hillary. He remembered that very acutely and resented it. So it was quite a drama. And in the end, it wasn't maybe a surprise that he stepped aside. It was a surprise that he did it on a Sunday. And did it in the way he did. And maybe being touched by COVID was just the last Shakespearean stroke of this drama.
It was clear that he had to walk through this decision, and it took him time. And as you said, it's understandable on a human level. Two things that I'm wondering about. One is this the end of his stepping down? I mean, is it at some point someone going to say, maybe it's better for Kamala Harris to come as president? So don't do the Lyndon Johnson, Hubert Humphrey move, but actually step down as president. Is that something anyone is telling him at this point? And you mentioned Obama, and to me, always that was an interesting thing. They sold the world, right? It's a bromance. They have a wonderful relationship, but it's very, very clear now. It's really out in the open. The former Obama staff and the Biden staff, and what they think about each other, everything was pretty open on Twitter. And of course, that kind of Joe Biden disgruntled feeling like he was the kid from Scranton who was never taken seriously by the elites, by the people who went to the Ivy League colleges. How much of that is existing?
And some of this is mythology, too. Joe Biden, yes, he's from Scranton, but at the same time comes from a family that was kind of local aristocracy that lost a lot of their money. It's a much more complicated history than, all politicians have their own self-mythology. They're up from the bootstraps. Ever since certainly Andrew Jackson, you've had to come from a log cabin in some way, whether that log cabin was in Hawaii or Arizona or whatever. What's always true is that the relationship between presidents and vice presidents is always fraught. Imagine you're the president, and in the next room is some person that wants you at some level to get off the stage, living or dead. And in the other room, the vice president is looking toward the Oval Office saying, I can't wait till that guy leaves so I can inhabit that office. The dynamic is innately fraught, even when it's as close as, say, Bill Clinton and Al Gore, who seemed like in some ways the same guy.
And you just explained why monarchs and their children have a relationship that's fraught too, but that's another issue.
It's not dissimilar in some ways. But the dynamic here was that, yes, it was a personal drama, but what's infinitely more important than an 81-year-old's confrontation with, let's face it, mortality and what just precedes it, is the fate of the country. The fate of the country. What's at stake here is not tax policy. What's at stake here is not marginal differences on a particular issue. What's at stake here, and I don't think I'm exaggerating, is are you going to go forward with a deeply diminished democracy led by someone who shows all the signs of being unstable, and I'm being polite, or something different, or something different? And I think that Kamala Harris, who is, is not perfect. I mean, who is by any stretch? And she'll be examined very deeply in the weeks to come, very quickly, is 59 years old. And she's not an authoritarian. And she's not a lunatic. And does she have the time to win? And I think in the end, Joe Biden's drama will be judged based on what happens in November. If Kamala Harris loses, I think Joe Biden will be judged to have waited too long and should have stepped aside and have been, as promised, a bridge and a one-term president. If Kamala Harris wins, he'll be seen as someone who selflessly stepped aside in the service of the nation, and the nation was rescued. Trump supporters out there will not see it this way, but that's the way I see it.
But he's not going to step in. He's not going to say, you know what,
No.
I'm done with the presidency.
No.
That's not going to happen.
No, I don't think so. There's talk of that. And we even ran a piece by Jeannie Suk-Gerson, who's a law professor at Harvard, talking about the constitutional means for that and the logic for that. But no, I don't see that happening.
So the interesting thing is, first of all, Kamala Harris becoming cool, like in a few days, right? She was this deeply flawed candidate. Some of it was probably her fault. Some of it was the world's fault. I will throw the word misogyny in there because it needs to be thrown out in there. But
Sexism, racism, take your pick.
all of it. But now she's suddenly the cool candidate. And as you said, there's hope and there's enthusiasm. There are new, volunteers. The number of volunteers are in the Obama numbers.
Fundraising
that is how much
through the
enthusiasm. Roof. Right. And so, first of all, how did that happen?
Generation.
I mean, look. But that happened instantly.
Donald Trump's pop culture frame of reference is golf and things of his generation, of the 70s. Anytime a pop culture reference pops out of his mouth, or God forbid something as joyous as music, it's from 40 years ago. His mentor is probably not even known to people under the age of 50. Roy Cohn, the great horrific lawyer. That's who he learned his kind of Machiavellian political skills from, and his moral universe is shaped by. Here along comes somebody who's not 70. Trump is 78 now. Here's somebody who's 59 and who comes from a biracial background and who is, it's not like she's a cool DJ who's 23, but she is reasonably fluid.
She's cooler.
Anybody would be. Anybody would be. And she's not crazy. So I think this has turned Donald Trump's world upside down. He still may win. In fact, he's still got to be considered the favorite. But Donald Trump expected to be running against Joe Biden. He's still texting about him. He's still posting on social media about him as if that were the opponent.
Yeah, he definitely misses Joe Biden on that. Let's talk VP, because I know we talked, you and I, and you said that Josh Shapiro, governor of Pennsylvania, is actually, I know, he's seriously considered. I don't want to sound, parochial or glib or anything. Is this good for the Jews? And I'm asking the question because I have a good friend.
It didn't take long, did it?
I think we're 10 minutes in. Yeah. Well,
fact,
it actually took
so
a
long?
little too long, I would say, to ask that question. But, I have a good friend who's American and Jewish, and she called me up after the debate debacle, Joe Biden, and she said, the only silver lining I have is no one can blame the Jews for this.
Yeah.
That's the operative word. You're right. But if you have the Josh Shapiro as the VP and she loses, then you're going to have people blaming the Jew for this. So I'm just wondering where I'm here to amuse you, David. So I'm wondering where the VP question is at this point. We're talking here on a Thursday.
Well, what you've got is such a tight race that political calculations in states really matter. You've got Mark Kelly in Arizona. Arizona is crucial. If she can win Arizona, that's indicative of something that is amazing. But the key here is Pennsylvania, as you've heard 3 bazillion times. Pennsylvania, she cannot win without Pennsylvania. I don't see it. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. Right?
Yeah, genius system you guys have over there. Yep.
Let's not even, the electoral college is Michigas at the highest degree. But that's what we have. And it's anti-democratic, it's minoritarian, but that's what we've got. Arizona was considered out of the ball game, just like Georgia. But Mark Kelly is an attractive figure too. Military veteran, astronaut, knows a little something about foreign policy, which is a rarity. Competent, intelligent. Obviously, he's married to Gabby Gifford, who was shot. Thank God, survived, but grievously wounded. So that's an attractive figure in many ways. And there are some others. Gretchen Whitmer decided to withdraw from this consideration. But we'll see. We'll see.
Again, to be very parochial, let's say something about Kamala Harris in Israel, which is a conversation that has been going on here, obviously. Yeah. And there are all kinds of things being pointed out, right? On the one hand, at least to me and to many other Israelis, the fact that she hosted an event about the sexual violence on October 7th and said, we can't be silent about that is very important. There are many things that she says about Israel's security and what Hamas did, calling out Hamas. That all in the Israeli basket goes into the right place from the point of view of how Israelis see it. You have other things that she said, right? That she said there might be repercussions for Israel if it goes into Rafah. Other things that have worried, particularly the Israeli government, when she said that the Israeli government and the Israeli people are two different things. By the way, they are. And what I've found very interesting, you call this a generational difference. I think that's very true between her and Joe Biden on Israel. But also, I've been hearing more and more Israelis saying that word that we heard during the Obama era, which was kishkes, right? The comeback of the kishkes. Does she love us in her gut? Which is a question, by the way, no one's asking it about Trump, which is an interesting thing.
He doesn't, love is not part of his vocabulary.
Her, it's a recurrent. So it is a recurring, now that the question did make a comeback.
I remember the first time we had a conversation on this show, and this long before this crisis, and I tried to talk about the generational differences here. I see it. This is not limited to people in high office by age. It is across the board. There's a secular divide with religious, as you know, but also if you've grown up and your experience of Israeli politics and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and crisis that's going on for so long is purely through the lens of Bibi Netanyahu's era, you're going to see the world differently and Israel differently than someone my age. Not that I haven't changed over time as circumstances have changed over time. And I think you hear that reflected, if subtly, in the rhetoric that Joe Biden has allowed himself in public and even what he says in private, and the same thing with Kamala Harris. There's a slightly different tone. Same thing with Obama, who, after all, is still quite a bit younger than Joe Biden. Barack, I used to talk with Israelis in the Netanyahu circle, but even broader than that, and they would say, Obama he doesn't feel us in our kishkas. This was, from some of them, what I was hearing was just unadulterated racism, I'm sorry. And some of it was, oh my God, he likes Haaretz and Tel Aviv and that aspect of Israel, starting to make a cartoon of it, but he has no feeling for us innately, meaning us, the Netanyahu circle. That was right. That was right.
Yeah.
Why should he? Why should he innately, unflaggingly, unquestioningly have it in his kishkas to be supportive of Benjamin Netanyahu? Yeah. And Biden only gave voice to that in private, whether as vice president, you remember him being infuriated by Netanyahu. And there came a point in this war, and many will argue that it came belatedly or too belatedly, where his frustration with Netanyahu was extraordinary. Here's a guy who got on the plane, comes to Israel, and embraces rhetorically, politically, and actually Netanyahu.
Yep.
And he becomes yet another president who feels betrayed, ignored by, and duped by the Israeli Prime Minister. So I don't know who has Kishka's feel that's not just an activist on the right here. Things have changed. And to make a cartoon of it, sometimes I hear a cartoon made of the protests here as if this was a kind of massive pro-Hamas uprising on college campuses by useful idiots. I think that's unfair too, deeply unfair.
I do want to ask something, as much as I, can go on and on about what Israelis feel, but to me, I find something about Kamala Harris very interesting, and that's the story when you think of Hillary Clinton. Now, I never met Harris, but I did meet Clinton. I interviewed her in September 2016. We were both in the room, and we thought that room had the next president of the United States, but we were wrong. And it was very clear she was... I remember that story of you writing the Trump story very quickly on your laptop,
True.
in November 2016. But it is I think you'd agree that there is a huge gap with Hillary Clinton. You meet her the one-on-one, she's, charming and she's funny and she's personable, and then something happens when she's in rallies or on television, there's something else there. It just doesn't cut across to the public. Did this country change? Did the United States change in those 8 years? I mean, for example, when you have Van Jones on CNN saying, we tolerated what they said, black men tolerated what they said about Hillary, we're not going to tolerate what they say. If they make fun of, the Republicans make fun of Kamala Harris, we're going to be there and we're going to protect her. Is something fundamentally, deeply different 8 years on that will allow this country to elect a woman president?
I think we're going to find out. I think it is amazing. It is amazing that we've reached 2024 and we've never had a woman elected president. And there were many aspects to why Hillary Clinton lost. Some of it absolutely has to do with misogyny. Some of it has to do that it was a reaction to 8 years of a black president. The first person to admit that and recognize that is Barack Obama himself. Some of it had to do with Hillary Clinton making mistakes as a campaigner, or as the case will be in Michigan and Wisconsin, non-campaigner. There were tactical mistakes. And some of it has to do with the very real appeal, however regrettable and horrific in many ways, of Donald Trump. We shouldn't forget that. A large part of this country, this is a complicated country. When I hear the phrase, whether it's Charlottesville or in the election of 2016 or so many other, this is not who we are. No, it's very much part of who we are. The complexity of the American experience embraces both the election of Barack Obama in 2008 and the election of Donald Trump. Just as the business, when I hear, kind of a liberal Israeli friend say, Ben Gvir is not who we are, or Smotrich is not who we are. No, that's not true. That's deeply a part of what modern Israel is, as well as the person I'm talking to. These banalities of this is not who we are don't serve us well in trying to think and assess who we are critically. And, the other day, asking you about this, what is the meaning or non-meaning of Ben Gvir saying, we're going to change the policy of who can come and go to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is a very provocative thing, or the vote in the Knesset, what was it, a week and a half ago, Yonit, about a two-state solution. What was the purpose of that? Who was that signaling toward? What was the political meaning of it?
I mean, that's two different things. And one is Ben Gvir trying to embarrass Netanyahu as Netanyahu is about to take the stage in Congress, because Ben Gvir wants to be in the war cabinet that makes the decisions about the war. And Netanyahu, who allowed for this man to be a minister and to be a very powerful minister, even he has his limits on what he thinks is possible to do for Itamar Ben Gvir. And because he said no, essentially, or tried, it's Netanyahu, he never says no. He tries to find this idea in which there's a medium-sized cabinet that doesn't make any decisions, and that's the cabinet that Ben Gvir can sit on. So Ben Gvir was trying to embarrass Netanyahu by saying what he said about Temple Mount. Netanyahu coming out directly and saying that's not true. He did other things to embarrass him and to take his focus. One of them is saying that he supports Trump, which is not a good look for Netanyahu, again, as he speaks to Congress. So that's one thing. You asked about the Knesset. That decision, by the way, has absolutely no legal binding whatsoever. Because if there is a political gesture
that meant what?
Yes, but we should just say, if there will be a decision about the Palestinian state, it will not have the government will not do this without the Knesset's agreement. So whatever that vote is, it doesn't really matter. It signals that Israel, makes its own decisions by itself, and the Israeli right will show the world that no matter what, it has its power. It creates the damage on the international stage, but it doesn't have actually any significance.
One detail of it that I don't know how to interpret, although I suspect I do, is Benny Gantz voted with the great majority.
Yeah.
It seems to me that what Netanyahu has changed the terms of the political game, and the terms of the political game are, if you support me, there will never be a Palestinian entity or state. That's different from what his in terms were before, which is "I will keep you safe," which he can no longer run on. Benny Gantz has to distinguish himself somehow from being not Netanyahu, other than not being Benjamin Netanyahu. But on this central issue, he doesn't seem to allow himself any rhetorical or political room to move. And here in the United States, when we're constantly being told that Benny Gantz is, even now, although those polls have diminished, is the most likely person to succeed or beat Netanyahu down the line, whatever that might be, he seems to be with him on that. Or are we interpreting that incorrectly?
I would say this about Benny Gantz. First of all, the political system in general is rewriting its story. It's realigning, right? It's not the right or the left, or you would clearly say Palestinian state, yes or no. You are either in the Bibi camp or the anti-Bibi camp. That's what you have. Still, by the way, even after the shock and the aftermath of October 7th, that is the question. And for Israelis, David, just think about this logic. Israelis, again, what they're telling themselves, right? We left Gaza, dismantled all settlements, and this is what we got. We got a massacre. So the idea of a Palestinian state, an independent Palestinian state, is how shall we say this delicately? It has less and less supporters in Israel today. Things can change, the world can change, but that is the situation. Benny Gantz is always trying to look at what the left flank is doing, what the right flank is doing. He thinks he made this mistake before the last elections to talk about a Palestinian state, and then he lost the right-wing vote. So he's trying to find himself in this. My prediction about this, and I've said it more than once in the podcast, there is a very large sentiment that is very anti-Netanyahu, but is very much in the right. And the person who would garner that, be it Naftali Bennett or Avigdor Lieberman, they can be easily the next prime minister. I'm not sure you can say it's as easy for Benny Gantz. But we're wandering into the Israeli topic, which is fine. So we should say something about the Netanyahu speech, although we will go into that with Amos Harel. But definitely we should say, again, from the Israeli point of view, this was primetime television. Netanyahu wouldn't miss that, right? It will be at 9 o'clock, 52 minutes, 52 standing ovations. The frame that the Israeli public saw was mainly of the Republican side of the aisle. They were, very enthusiastic about this speech throughout. And this is exactly why Netanyahu wanted this moment to show and, how much he is. And again, this is the image. Netanyahu and Trump, they both understand that. The image is that he is receiving a warm hug from the United States Congress. What wasn't shown in the frame is things like Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer or Hakeem Jeffries not, giving him a standing ovation. By the way, we did see that moment.
They seem to have other places they had to be. Some of the other suddenly they had other appointments with the dentist.
And they missed the handshake, right? Chuck Schumer not shaking the hand of the Israeli prime minister. I mean, all those kinds of moments. Look, he knows. But
you reported this. I'm sure you reported this on Channel 12. Of course you did. And so how did it play there?
First of all, it's 52 minutes of Netanyahu talking. And as I said, 52 instances of standing ovation. So I would,
52 minutes of your life that you'll never get back.
At least I don't have to translate it simultaneously anymore. There were years when I had to do that.
They work
and at least now we have
They made you simultaneously translate it.
I would do that, yes. And by the way, just in parentheses, the worst person to translate simultaneously was George W. Bush.
Why is
because
that?
He would always give these verses from the Bible. And then think of the poor Israeli anchorwoman who needs to translate from English
directly
into Hebrew. And if she misses a word of not knowing how the verse goes in Hebrew,
the yeshiva bookers are all over you.
Yep. Exactly. My kishkis are out on the table. This is going to be the operative word of our podcast today. So that was how it played out here. And you can go into all of the details of him, bringing some of the hostages who were rescued, like Noah Gamani, and the soldiers and the heroes. But a lot of Israelis are saying, wait a minute, but what are you doing to bring back the hostage? What are you doing for the soldiers who have now, some of them, been doing 220 days of reserve service, and now his government wants to extend that, right?
I got to tell you, Yonit, here, it didn't play. It didn't play.
Of course not.
Because this war has been going on for... what are we in now, 9 months, 10 months? And he's been in office for 14 years. We've seen these speeches before. Unless you are unquestioningly in his camp, do or die. You saw this as just wet wash. It's just old stuff, and the only difference is this time he didn't hold up a cartoon of Obama. It was nobody watched the 52 minutes, and it wasn't even the lead story on news by the time of the evening, because Biden was giving his what amounts to a kind of farewell address, at least as a candidate. The weariness, the sadness, the anger, in a lot of directions about this is so long-standing that I don't think this speech moved anybody. And the performance of a mainly Republican audience and the getting up and cheering and the kind of trying to replicate the State of the Union is nonsense. This was not Václav Havel comes to Congress. This is not Anwar Sadat comes to the Knesset. Didn't have that drama or sense of history. I thought it was pathetic in many ways.
Well, we have much more to talk about, which is, the war and the hostages and where this is all going. And it was pretty easy for the both of us to choose the guest we want to talk to this week. It was a pretty simple conversation.
It really was. He, as we say in basketball, he's the layup of all time. You're not going to miss by calling on this guy. Some years ago, I wrote a long piece in The New Yorker about Haaretz. As a left-leaning newspaper, it speaks, at least on the surface, to a diminishing tribe of left-of-center readers in Israel and to largely secular English-speaking foreigners like my own fallen self. One reader of that piece was Barack Obama, who wanted to meet and talk about its implications, and that was an interesting conversation we can get to at some point. But what has always been plain to me, never more than during this crisis of the past year, is that one of the great reporters in Israel, and one of the great reporters anywhere on the globe, someone with immense integrity, extraordinary sources, and a total lack of agenda or cant, is Amos Harel. Not for nothing is Amos a frequent guest of Unholy, and someone I always call up for wisdom for pieces of my own. And there's a lot to discuss today, God knows. Amos, welcome.
Hi, David. Thanks. And Yonit.
Hi, Amos. It's good to have you on.
I guess we should start with maybe the obvious. Netanyahu's speech yesterday in Washington, which might not have been news story number one here in the United States, although it got a lot of attention, but it certainly was back in Israel. How was it received, Amos? How did you differentiate it from a million other such performances in the UN and Congress and as well as in Israel?
Well, first and foremost, this is a speech during war, and Netanyahu even chose to stay another few more days in America while the war is still fought at home. He was in his element, as usual, the Republican senator from Jerusalem, and the Republicans, of course, were very happy about that. And his Israeli admirers kept talking about his English. Did you ever listen to his English? He speaks better English than Yonit, I think. And there are very few Israelis who can claim to do that. And yet, I'm not exactly objective, contrary to what you were saying in the beginning. And after listening to the man for so many years, and especially during the last 9.5 months, I was not thrilled. It's hard to be thrilled by some of those tricks he's playing, PR tricks.
What are the tricks? What exactly are the kind of tricks and tropes and moves that he's doing in a speech like that, and toward what end?
Look, the guy knows how to speak to an audience. Again, and this perfect vocabulary and perfect accent that most Israelis don't share in English. When you listen to Yitzhak Rabin or Yitzhak Shamir, God forbid, it sounded different. It sounded like somebody coming from Kadrielipka in Eastern Europe to speak to the Gentiles. With Netanyahu, educated in Philadelphia, if I'm not mistaken, it's different. And then he knows all the tricks, all the Hollywood tricks, if you like it. The crippled veteran, not a veteran, a young soldier who fought for his country and was injured on the front lines. The hostage who was just released, according to his decision, as he put it a month ago, and now standing next to Sarah and all of those standing ovations. So I assume many Israel lovers in the United States, many good Jewish people following us with some concern, were enthusiastic about it. And yet, if you follow the man for so many years, it's very easy to see what kind of tricks he's playing. And to my ears, this sounded empty. I didn't hear anything about a plan for what would happen next in Gaza, except for a very brief remarks that actually didn't say anything. What I waited for, I knew that I was waiting in vain, was some kind of admittance of responsibility to what has happened. It's true that Hamas is to blame for the horrific events of October 7th, but it happened on his watch. When he says never again, he should admit that it happened on his watch at least once. And of course, nothing like this was said. And while he was speaking there, the Israeli chief of staff, Herzi Halevi, the chief of staff of the IDF, just finished a meeting with the residents of Kibbutz Be'eri, hundreds of them, who are, of course, uprooted from their homes, living in hotels near the Dead Sea, who wanted to know about the army's internal investigation about what has happened at their kibbutz. More than 100 people killed and more than 30 kidnapped by Hamas on October 7th. So there's quite a difference between Halevi, who is in pain, really in pain for what has happened on his watch, and between the way Netanyahu sees this.
Yeah, I was listening to the speech. It really was, he described October 7th as something that happened to us, right? And he did it rather adroitly, and for long minutes. It was a 52-minute speech, and he laid the case of what happened to Israel. But as you said, he kind of described it like he's a pundit on television and not someone who was the prime minister when this happened. Of course, to this day, objects to a commission of inquiry to be set up about partially what he was responsible for. I found it also interesting the fact that, if Netanyahu was used to doing anything in front of Congress, we all remember that speech of 2015, it was to talk about Iran and the nuclear threat. I think there were even some props involved in the past. He didn't even mention it this time. That is an interesting point.
Yeah, I think he mentioned it. He mentioned it briefly once. Mm-hmm. And my explanation, I stole it from somebody else. A friend of mine, Udi Eventhal, just tweeted on this morning.
Yeah.
And
he's a retired colonel, we should say. Yeah.
And he thinks that this is, it goes back to 2015 and Netanyahu's speech against Obama before the agreement, and Netanyahu's insistence on persuading Trump to get out of the deal in 2018. Since this has actually led to Iran becoming dangerously close to becoming a nuclear power, this is not something that he wanted mentioned in Congress that day. But that's the first time he hasn't mentioned the Iranian nuclear threat. He talked about the so-called ring of fire around Israel. He talked about Iranian involvement in helping Hamas and Hezbollah, Iranians looking to destroy Israel and so on. But hardly any mention of the nuclear issue. I think it was mentioned once, if I'm not mistaken, Yonit.
Amos, what is the politics of the inability, or is it just pride and the fear of losing his seat, the politics of not ever mentioning any sense of regret or responsibility? Netanyahu himself, who's been in power for the better part of 14 years, as well as a term in the 90s, would say over and over again, the chief responsibility of being prime minister of Israel is to protect Israel. And there was, as we know, there was a colossal failure of intelligence, defense, imagination even, and you've seen a series of resignations already begin. The brigadier general who put out the call the mornings at 6:30 in the morning that the Philistines have broken through the gates, Avi Rosenfeld has already resigned. The chief of intelligence in the Defense Department has resigned. And others to come, and it's presumed that there'll be an investigation like there was in 1973. But not a word. There's a certain soullessness to his approach, his inability to embrace hostages in the early part of this horrible crisis is inconceivable. How do you view it biographically and politically?
My guess is that it begins with a political motive. He's fighting for his life. He knows that he's still facing probable jail time in his legal problems. There's a trial for 3 different counts of corruption, and it's not going very well. And he's supposed, his testimony is supposed to be taken, I think, within a few months. So when you're battling for your political survival and your personal survival, you don't admit mistakes because you give something away to your political enemies. But on top of that, I think there's, and you've probably known him longer than I do, I think it has to do with Trump as well. Remember Trump arriving on the political arena and refusing to say sorry for anything.
Ever.
And I
Never
think,
apologize.
And I think Netanyahu stole a page from his book. But also, if we go back, even Naftali Bennett, Yonit, you probably remember that. A few years ago, when Naftali Bennett was the head of a small right-wing party, there was even a campaign where he said, we are never going to say sorry for anything. Mafsikim להתנצל. We've stopped apologizing. So I think it's a familiar sentiment in the right, or the hard right, and maybe Netanyahu now feels, again, that he's above all this, that he's such a great man, such a historic figure, that he doesn't need to apologize for anything on top of his political motives, not to admit any kind of failure.
I would think there's maybe a psychological aspect as well. I mean, the fact that if he meets, and he didn't meet that many times with hostages' families, it's just seeing your terrible failure in front of your eyes, even if you constantly say it's not your responsibility, it was the military, still, it is the, glaring black hole of everything that has been happening here. And that leads me to ask you, Amos, is there, where do we assess where we are? There are now 115 hostages in Gaza. Out of them, Israel estimates 74 are alive. We hope the number is higher, but what are the chances for a deal? Does he want a deal? Is he the one that's delaying this? Where do you think this stands?
Well, first of all, there are less hostages who are still alive. It's assumed that less than half of them, around somewhere between 55 or 60, are still alive.
It's just terrible.
And they're gradually dying because they're kept in terrible conditions, and many of them are tortured by Hamas as well. The hostages we've seen come back just recently were released by Israeli forces and were held above ground. And there's quite a difference between staying at a Palestinian home under terrible circumstances and being kept in a tunnel, 50, 60 meters underground and not seeing the light of day for all of this time. And many of the people who were abducted, you have to remember, were old people in their 70s and their 80s, men, and we know that many of them have died already. So the chances for releasing so many of them, doing another Entebbe, it's not in the cards. It's not going to happen. There may be one operation or another with very few people brought back. And we've had the experience again of 5 bodies brought back yesterday. And forgive me for saying this, but this is actually quite comfortable from the government's point of view. These hostages will not speak again. They're dead. The bodies are now buried in different ceremonies across Israel now, but none of them is going to be able to tell his story. Not about the terrible events of October 7th, how they were neglected and deserted by the country, by the state of Israel, or what happened later. In this case, these are people who actually were killed on that day and their bodies abducted by Hamas. Now, regarding the chances, it's very hard to tell because there are, you remember Sharon many, many years ago, I think it was in Netanyahu's first term, once saying as Netanyahu's foreign minister, I don't know if I should believe your right side or your left side, your right hand
your left
or your
hand
left
or your
hand.
right hand.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's the same kind of sentiment now. It keeps changing. It keeps evolving his positions. One day he speaks to the hostages in Washington and promises them that there's a light at the end of the tunnel and that hopefully a deal would be signed very shortly. On the other hand, every now and then, every few days, there are either leaks to the press, mostly to sympathetic journalists, or there are statements being made. Most recently, you know that Israel gave an answer to the mediators in late May, and then there were other answers from Israel coming and from Hamas coming back and forth all through June and then July. In the beginning of July, it seemed after Hamas's most recent answer that actually Hamas was willing to become more flexible because of the military pressure and that there was a chance to actually sign a deal. And yet, since then, what we hear from Netanyahu is sort of hardline positions regarding the Philadelphia corridor, the small area between Egypt and Gaza Strip. Now he's saying that Israel needs to maintain control of that area in order to avoid Hamas returning to operate smuggling tunnels. And then there's what's called the Netzarim corridor, which cuts the Gaza Strip to half between the south and the north. And then he keeps giving all kinds of statements about new demands there. And we know that all of the security apparatus, starting from Yoav Gallant, the Minister of Defense, but also all of the other security chiefs are now telling him, look, this is too much. We've seen Hamas become more flexible. We need to negotiate now. We need to get those hostages out. And it's a risk we can take under the circumstances. Netanyahu thinks of this differently.
To some degree, it seems like what he has in mind for the so-called day after is the West Bankization of Gaza in a very rough degree, post Second Intifada, which is to say the neutralization of any fighting force there, despite the fact that some will persist. It won't be an army. It'll be at best a small insurgency, but splitting it up and dividing it. And you hear talk of resettling Gaza, not on crazies that are howling in the street, but rather from people in the government. How serious is that?
I'm not sure it's that serious. It's frightening, especially after seeing that type of thing happen in the past. And yet, when he was asked, the only time he gave an interview to Israeli media was, of course, at his home base at Channel 14, our version of Fox. And it was about a month ago. And the people around him, it's quite a strange scenario in which there's more than one guy interviewing him. There were about 5 or 6 and an audience around him, all of them great Netanyahu supporters. And
you use the word interview loosely, almost, to describe that.
And some of them made the point of asking him about the settlements. Why don't we rebuild settlements? And he said, it's not going to happen. I don't support that. It's not going to happen. So I think at least regarding this, Netanyahu himself understands the international response, a possible response, and he knows what his limitations are regarding that.
Does he know his limitations? It's common talk about annexation of the West Bank. I mean, why would it? What are the limitations?
To some extent regarding Gaza.
Uh-huh. And
yet, I think that you're absolutely right about this West Bankization of Gaza, meaning that he's looking for he wants a very weak central government or if at all, central rule in Gaza. He wants Hamas out of the picture, and he wants the IDF to make ground incursions every now and then and to defeat and destroy anything that new that grows there on a military level. And the army is actually saying the same thing. What the army is saying is, look, we have an opportunity right now, a window of opportunity, quite narrow and limited, to reach a deal regarding what they call the humanitarian group, which is more or less half of the live hostages, and bring them back. Then you have a period of 42 days, and if things go wrong, then you can always find an excuse and go back to fighting. And even Biden, in some way, has been saying similar things to Netanyahu, while assuming that because of the events and the dynamics of the negotiations, Israel would not have an opportunity to go back to fighting. But this is what the discussion now is about. And even the IDF is saying, look, in the long run, we may be forced to go your way, meaning more incursions, more ground fighting every now and then. But the enemy on the other side would be weakened. And at one point or another, maybe would be successful enough to create an alternative in Gaza. But this is, I'm not saying that they're spreading illusions, but this seems quite far-fetched at this time. It does seem like we're all stuck in this sort of wishful thinking about the other side, and we keep trying to force our ideas on the enemy, while Sinwar is playing a very, very different game.
Yeah, and it has been 10 months of us playing that wishful thinking and not waking up from it. I do want to ask, because we need to, I think, tie it down to what is going on, or tie it into what is going on in the United States. You have a president stepping down from the race, and on the one hand being not at all tied to a legacy, but not to his reelection campaign. What does that mean? What does the defense echelon in Israel think this means? That Biden would go for a Saudi deal, that Biden would continue to push for a hostage deal? What does that even mean if you look at an option, I'm taking it a few months forward, but an option of a Trump presidency or a Harris presidency?
The greatest question right now has to do with energy. how much energy, how much resources does Biden have, considering the situation, his decision to leave? What's his health like? How can he focus? And will he actually be able to move forward with his ideas? And what the Israeli top brass heard from its counterparts on the American side recently in all of those meetings was that especially the Democrats and the people around Biden himself were extremely worried about the outcome in the elections, of course. They worried that Trump would win this. They worried that Trump would become the first American dictator. And this is what they were thinking about constantly. Now, I think, again, both of you know a lot more about this than I do. But I think that the sense is that things are slightly different, that Harris is, in fact, a candidate and that she has a chance of winning this. And now it's not really clear how these months are going to evolve. President Biden, even yesterday, his latest statement, I think, again, he mentioned Israel, he mentioned the hostages, and his attempts to reach a ceasefire and an end to fighting in Gaza. And I think probably Vice President Harris would sound quite the same regarding these issues. But maybe, just maybe, Netanyahu is thinking, look, I'm off the hook here. I don't know. He may be hoping that Biden doesn't have the energy to force something on him. Regarding Trump, I would suspect that Netanyahu, being that experienced, has no illusions about Trump, that he knows exactly what he's up against, who he's dealing with, and he remembers every word of that interview that Trump gave our colleague Barak Ravid in 2021.
You should probably say what was the quote. The quote was classic.
I don't remember it, but anyway, it was about Netanyahu refusing.
David wants to say the bad word. David, if you want to say the bad word.
He was mad at Netanyahu for recognizing quite quickly Biden's victory. I think Netanyahu actually made a point of not recognizing the victory for 2 or 3 days.
Took a few days.
Yeah, being Netanyahu. And yet, what was the exact word? Was it schmuck or was it something else?
It was worse, and I don't say
it's a
such
Jewish
words.
podcast.
It's an F word, and we're not going to say it because my parents listen to the
Yonit's
podcast.
Parents.
So
in respect to Yonit's parents, you know what? It's always struck me almost is that of the many vanities of Benjamin Netanyahu, one is his sense that he has complete mastery over American politics and American public opinion. You remember he went to see people in the West Bank, and there was some concern about American public opinion over settlements, and he whispered in the ear, sotto voce, so that all the cameras and recorders could hear it, "Don't worry, I know how to control and take care of the Americans." This is always his vanity. And he comes before Congress yesterday, and he comes up with some formulation about, to be pro-Hamas, gay and pro-Hamas is to be a chicken and pro-Kentucky Fried Chicken, or some ridiculously glib analysis of the entire of American public opinion and protests here, as if all the protesters here on the streets are pro-Hamas, instead of the vast majority of them being outraged by tens of thousands of dead people, and many of them feeling it is in their name. And he thinks he has complete mastery of every American president, too, that he knows how to play them. I had the most interesting conversation. I want you to tell me how to analyze this. I went to see somebody, let's say, extremely close to Netanyahu, who on the alter ego level. And I say, who is your favorite and least favorite American president that you've dealt with? And I knew who the least favorite was. They hated Obama for reasons that we can expand on at great length. It was, which I find revolting, but okay. And then it came down to, what do you prefer at that time, Biden or Trump? And they said Biden. And I said, and who is your least favorite president? Trump. I found this shocking, and I also found it to be untrue. And I said, well, why? He said, because Trump is so unpredictable. He's so chaotic. I thought I was being played here. How do the upper levels of the Israeli government, including the Netanyahu circle, really want things to come out in November?
That's a tough question, and I don't think I have enough information about this. But again, I think that Netanyahu is perfectly aware of this factor of unpredictability surrounding Trump. When you see Biden, you know exactly what you're expecting to hear, that old Golda Meir anecdote, and the fact that he's a Zionist, a Catholic, and an Irish, but a Zionist as well, and so on. Harris, a mystery wrapped in an enigma for the time being. We'll see what happens in the next few months.
It's a generational difference there. You could see it in the limits of her patience were different than the limits, at least of Biden's public patience, were very different.
Exactly. And she has to think of the progressive camp in the Democratic Party as well. Trump, look, what I've seen, I haven't been following this as closely as you are, again, because of the war here. But what I've heard of Trump's statements recently, he's unhinged. It's worse than, 8 years ago. He's coming back with a vengeance. All of this talk about urban being the right kind of model for America and so on. For some Israelis, that is frightening. I don't think that the specific Israeli person you met is actually frightened by his worried about the outcome for American democracy. But if you have somebody as powerful as Trump, and those around him would not be the same kind of team he had in 2017, that would be very, very hard for Israel to judge, to understand, to figure out. And remember, we're always one mistake away or two mistakes away from oblivion. This is the way Israelis see their strategic situation, in spite of the assumptions about our nuclear power and our air force and about our support from the United States and so on. We cannot take too many chances. Netanyahu's mistakes, in a way, led to what happened on October 7th. But you can't bet again. And if Trump gets angry at us, for instance, look, if you're Ukrainian, you're in panic regarding Trump right now. And if you look at this from Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, you can see some similarities. Again, if he stops support for Ukraine, how far behind is a decision over Israel? In spite of what he's saying now, in spite of his Jewish grandchildren and so on.
When you look at, the fact that we've been talking about Gaza, we've been talking about American politics, but we haven't been mentioning Iran that much. And you see all of the signs on the ground, right? First of all, Iran, for the first time in history, attacking Israel directly on April 13th, sending now the Houthis and their drone over Tel Aviv. You have Hezbollah, which is Iran's proxy. Are we right to say Iran's maybe pushing Hezbollah to more into this sort of flare-up with Israel? How are we Israelis, and to read this? And can Israel really deter Iran in this position that it is now, embroiled in this war still in Gaza? Can we do that?
There's something changing about Iran and the region. It's quite clear for a long time that Iran sees itself as a regional superpower, wants to get back to its historic position in the Middle East, and is not that afraid of the world superpowers, and especially the United States. And of course, the Iranians are taking advantage of all kinds of changes in the international arena. More than anything else, look at their new alliance with Russia, the way they surprised everybody by supplying the Russians with all of those thousands of attack drones. That was quite a feat that they achieved recently. But it's more than that. Not only Israeli right-wingers. Look at what Ehud Barak is saying about Iran's intentions. He's actually speaking time after time. And of course, you can go back and remind me of Barak's hawkish positions regarding the debate over attacking Iran's nuclear project in 2011, 2012. And yet what Barak in 2024 is saying, that Iran is actively seeking to destroy Israel, that it's a new Iranian plan, and that after October 7th, they actually believe that this can be initiated, that this could be implemented, that Israel could actually be destroyed quicker than they thought, and that Khamenei has this line of thinking, or the people around him think in such terms, then this is different from the Israeli perspective than the past. When Bennett spoke of fighting the octopus a few years back, not many people listened. He seemed a new arrival on the strategic arena. He wanted to show that he was smarter than everybody else, that he was, that he had less restraint perhaps than Netanyahu. And yet others are speaking in similar terms right now. It doesn't mean that Israel has to actively seek a fight, a war, a full-scale war with Iran. But what happened on April 13th is important. Israel was very proud of the fact that we intercepted most of those rockets and attack drones, and that we were helped by the Americans, and that many Arab countries were secretly helping us, intercepting and recognizing the different threats. And yet, if the Iranian planners go back to their plans and say, What if we launch 1,000 projectiles next time instead of 330? What's there to stop them? This is concerning from an Israeli point of view. It's not only dealing with Hezbollah or with Hamas separately. It's a fear that there's somebody else behind this. And again, I don't think there's full control. The Houthis are, in a way, a sort of an independent electron, okay? They don't get actual orders from Tehran, and it's never known how they're going to act. The same is true for Hezbollah to some extent. But this is something that's more frightening to Israeli planners than before. And again, it goes back to what David has mentioned, Netanyahu describing himself as the great protector. Well, that's not going very well.
What is the point for the Iranian regime? I've never quite understood this. And here's a regime that is innately weak, whose population despises it, and whose population is not innately anti-Israeli. And yet the rhetoric from Iran is what it is about the destruction of Israel. But what is the point? In other words, and it's a poor country. Its economy is really struggling. What is the point for Iran? I'd be curious to know what Israeli intelligence, how it assesses this. What is the point of Iran pouring all its regime energies and resources into this confrontation that it is not likely to win? Is it a colossal political distraction? Is it a sense of messianic lunacy? There's got to be some realpolitik operating behind this impulse.
I'll take the easy route and say it's probably a combination of both. First of all, there's deep ideological hatred to Israel. It goes back to Israeli assistance to the Shah. In the 70s, the stories about Israeli advisors there to his secret services and so on. Mm-hmm. And the fact that Israel, of course, is in bed with the United States for so many years. And so some of this is ideological and even religious. And when you look at what they say and you read their speeches and so on, there's deep hatred towards two states and only two states, America and Israel, the big Satan and little Satan, or whatever. And as you said, it's also a very effective source of distraction. If you talk about the Israelis, you don't get to talk. You don't have to answer questions about unemployment, about your treatment of women in public spaces, about freedom of speech, about all of those prisoners you jail in Tehran and then execute them, whether secretly or not. I keep hoping that one day it will all collapse, but we haven't seen this coming. In 2009, what was called the Green Revolution turned out to be a failure. And since then, every 2-3 years, we have the experts saying, look at the hijab protests and so on. Something is about to change. Look at the public opinion polls. Right. Look at how the youngsters want to listen to pop music and want to have a free life without the religious clerics telling them what to do. And yet it never happens. They are very, very calculated in what they do. My sense, just as yours, is that they're making a big mistake regarding Israel, and that at one point or another it would lead to a confrontation not only with Israel but with the U.S. If Trump is in power and they try something like this, this could get out of hand. And yet they insist on doing so. And I don't think, as far as I've been following, don't see anybody there among the leaders who's different than Khamenei. Khamenei is 85 years old. You don't change your opinions or principles when you're that old. But even those youngsters around him in their early 70s, they're not thinking differently about this.
Amos Harel, you made us smarter. I'm not sure it was encouraging, but you did make us smarter.
You keep saying that, Yonit, time after time.
I know, because it's always true.
Why can't you be more optimistic?
I'm waiting for you to say something encouraging, but everything is going to be okay, Yonit.
Sure.
Why is it so hard to lie?
I'll text you a personal message.
Here's what's encouraging. It's possible to swim in the Seine River this week. So the French are telling us. That's it.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Amos, thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yonit, every time I bestir myself to do a long reporting piece about Israel, I never fail to call Amos Harel because it is a certain, he's just so deeply informed and has thought through these issues so carefully that, and is so generous, I should also say, that it never fails to astonish me. He's terrific.
I couldn't agree more. And you think of this man who's been the military analyst for 26 years, I think, perhaps a little bit more, and the last year of his life, what it has been like, what he has to deal with, the material he goes through, and the way he manages to present it, I think is something that not many people in this country know how to do, and not many people outside this country do either. David Remnick,
yes.
we will not let you go before our tradition. And you know what our tradition is, right?
Of course I do. Chutzpah and mensch.
And of course, you also know that it's usually the Israeli who will choose the chutzpah, because somehow
why would
diaspora
that be?
Jews.
Why would that be?
Because you diaspora Jews, you think that is somehow apt, and I didn't put up a fight.
I'm not commenting whatsoever.
So my choice is, you would think it's probably unoriginal, but I will explain.
Okay.
This, of course, has to do with Adidas and its uproar that was created this week.
Adidas the sneaker.
Adidas the sneaker.
Gotcha.
There's a way in which the Brits say Adidas that is very different from the way that you do.
They say so many funny things.
Anyway, so we were talking about the Adidas sneaker, and of course there was this uproar that had to do with Bella Hadid and the fact that she has the anti-Israeli rhetoric. And what happened was that they decided to relaunch their retro sneaker from the 1972 Munich Olympics, and they hired her as one of the models. Now, I don't even want to talk about that. Obviously, I think it's an egregious mistake, but that's not what I want to mention. I want to take this a few steps back.
Yeah.
And I want to ask, when this company that I understand wants to launch or relaunch its sneaker, very important, and of course making money is also very important. But when you think about what happened in the 1972 Olympics and what the world will remember, and what Israel and what Germany will remember, the fact that 11 Israeli athletes were murdered in this year and in these Olympics. And what you're thinking to yourself is, let's relaunch the sneaker from the 1972 Munich Olympics. And you think of these meetings, these board meetings, right?
With the manager,
meeting? The assistant, right, the marketing. There are dozens of people in this room, the assistant and the manager and everyone. No one sort of raises their hands and says, guys, maybe 1972 Olympics in Munich the world will not remember the sneaker from that event, right? I mean, let's relaunch whatever product we launched on September 11, 2001. No one's going to say that. So that to me is a little bit of chutzpah, even before I arrive at the Bella Hadid story. That's it. That was my rant for this week.
Wow. Well, so
this is why we let the Israelis do the chutzpah and the diaspora Jews do
damn right. And when I'm thinking about mensch, Yonit, we've talked enough about Joe Biden, the complexity of his decision. I also considered Nancy Pelosi, who was so masterful, some sort of combination of principled politician, one part of that, and one part Vito Corleone. She really it was really astonishing to watch her get Joe Biden to yes. Mm-hmm. But my mensch for the week is a historical one too, since you're talking in historical terms, and it's Nelson Mandela. Now, why? Right now in the Middle East, the fundamentalists are in charge. And I'm not making these moral equivalencies, but right now, Sinwar, Haniya, Marshall, they think of themselves as Saladin. They've scored this great historical victory. And in Israel, tragically, Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, they think of themselves as saviors while everybody else is, naive or worse. Nelson Mandela emerged from jail and could have followed the path of more armed struggle, and he chose instead something that has a fallen reputation, and it's called politics. And at some point, as in Ireland, as in many other times and places in history, the way out of the seemingly intractable demands requires something more than the force of arms. It demands moral imagination, and it demands politics. So, yes, we've heard this a million times. The Palestinians need their Nelson Mandela, but so too do the Israelis. And maybe sooner or later in history, we all do. So that's my mensch of the week.
Fun fact about Mensch of the Week, David, since you've listened to most of our episodes, I have to tell you that our very first pilot that we recorded 4 years ago, and we had only the chutzpah word. And a good friend of our podcast, Yisrael Kohlenfeld, called us up and said, you got to have something nice. So that is why we're doing the Mensch Award. Just as if we're going into history, I'm doing a little bit podcast history as well. David, it was such a pleasure to have you on. You never call, you never write, you never come visit. You
I
should come
never
visit
come
some
visit.
more. I made some coffee for you. I made some matzo ball soup. You
I
should
would
come more to
appreciate some
visit.
coffee.
How am I doing my
What my
Jewish
mother
thing, my
would call-
New Jersey Jewish accent?
It's not bad. My mother-in-law, my late beloved mother-in-law used to call it a coffee. Would you like a coffee?
A coffee.
I
So I
love
made
that.
a coffee for you.
I so
And you
miss
never
it.
come. You don't come enough. That's what I'm saying.
I was just there
it was
2
a
weeks
unique
ago.
pleasure. It was a pleasure and an honor. Thank you for doing it. And let me say our thank yous to Gaia Glazer, Omer Primat, and Omri Barak. And next episode, another guest co-host. It's a surprise. Wait for next week.
Sure, get somebody else. Thanks for having me, Yonit.